Donald Trump has once again turned his fire on India. The warning had been made, the threat had been issued, and now the action has arrived. What began as a tariff of 25% has now been doubled, transformed into a crushing 50% duty on Indian exports. For the United States, it was announced as a move to correct a trade imbalance. For India, it was more than a financial blow. It was a geopolitical signal, a turning point that could alter alliances across Asia and beyond. The message from Washington was blunt: comply or pay the price. But what America didn't expect was that this pressure, instead of forcing India into submission, would push it into the arms of its biggest rival, China. The story of how this trade war escalated and reshaped the global balance of power begins with a handshake few noticed. Away from cameras, away from headlines, India and China quietly aligned on something far bigger than a tariff dispute. That silent handshake has already begun redirecting $1.6 trillion in trade, creating a shockwave through the global economy. And the irony? The very tariffs designed to weaken rivals have ended up strengthening them. It started with oil. Black gold, the lifeblood of economies. Washington demanded that New Delhi cut off its purchases of Russian crude, framing it as a betrayal to the West. But for India, the equation was simple. 1.4 billion people needed fuel, factories needed energy, inflation needed control. To buy oil from Russia was not a political choice, it was survival. The doubling of tariffs was the breaking point. What might have been seen as a standard trade dispute suddenly became a test of sovereignty. India wasn't just being punished economically, it was being told what to do, how to behave, which partners to keep, and which to abandon. For a nation that prizes its independence, that was unacceptable. And so, when Washington treated India not as an ally, but as a subordinate, New Delhi did not bow. It pivoted. Enter China. Beijing had been waiting patiently, watching cracks appear in Washington's alliances. The timing could not have been better. Almost immediately, Chinese diplomats moved in with offers: reopen border trade routes, ease export restrictions on rare earths and fertilizers, expand flights between the two countries, and promise easier access to critical technology markets. For India, it was not a question of loyalty, but of necessity. If America was closing doors, China was opening them. Trade between India and China already stood at $135 billion a year, and with each handshake, each reopened route, that number began to climb. India's biggest conglomerates, from Reliance to Adani, once heavily invested in the Western market, suddenly recalibrated their strategies. If Washington's tariff wall was shutting them out, Beijing's gateways were pulling them in. Partnerships with Chinese EV and battery giants, once unthinkable, quickly became survival strategies. In the brutal tempo of global trade, hesitation meant death. India chose to adapt. But the story is not just corporate. It is deeply human. In Punjab, the agricultural backbone of India, the effects were devastating. Farmers who had spent years cultivating export-quality rice and spices saw their markets collapse overnight. A 50% tariff meant their produce, once a staple on American shelves, was now too expensive. For them, this wasn't diplomacy. It wasn't geopolitics. It was survival. The fury was immediate. Protests erupted. Effigies of Trump were burned. Families who had built their lives on trade with the U.S. now faced ruin, and their anger wasn't about global power games. It was about betrayal. In the cities, boardrooms whispered of strategy and survival, but in the villages, the protests spoke louder, a demand that India stand tall, a demand that sovereignty not be sold at the price of humiliation. This anger fueled something bigger, a national mood. India would not be dictated to. And so, New Delhi recalibrated its global position. What had long been seen as a predictable alliance system, Washington and its partners versus Beijing and its challengers, began to blur. India, once the anchor of U.S. strategy in Asia, chose a new posture: flexibility over loyalty, diversification over dependence. It was not betrayal, but calculation. In this calculation, China found opportunity. Beijing didn't boast, didn't shout, didn't impose. Instead, it offered options. Where Washington punished, Beijing persuaded. Where America set ultimatums, China offered alternatives. It wasn't fiery statements, but quiet opportunities that shifted the balance. And slowly, the triangle of power, US, India, China, began to tilt. The economic impact was immediate and brutal. Nearly 70% of Indian exports to the U.S., from pharmaceuticals to textiles, from spices to jewelry, suddenly faced a 50% tax wall. Factories slowed, orders vanished, margins evaporated. Companies that had depended on American consumers had to rethink their entire strategy, and as profits disappeared, jobs followed. What began as a tariff war became a chokehold. Meanwhile, India's pivot toward China had deeper implications. The revival of trade routes, the expansion of direct flights, and the promise of cooperation in clean technology signaled something far bigger than economics. This was the beginning of a potential realignment. BRICS, once dismissed as symbolic, suddenly looked like a viable platform for India's future. Partnerships with Brazil, South Africa, and Russia, guided by Beijing's economic muscle, offered India an alternative to Washington's heavy hand. This realignment did not go unnoticed. In Tokyo, Canberra, and Washington itself, alarm bells rang. The Quad, the US, Japan, Australia, and India, was suddenly under strain. If India began acting on its own terms, the very foundation of America's Indo-Pacific strategy could crack from within. Experts began to speak out. Fareed Zakaria warned that this was the most serious blow to U.S.-India relations in decades. Former U.S. Ambassador Kenneth Jester admitted that Trump's heavy-handed approach was pushing India straight into Beijing's orbit. Even Nikki Haley, one of Trump's closest allies, acknowledged that this rift, if ignored, could become permanent. And beneath all these warnings lies a truth that Washington is only beginning to realize. Trust, once broken, is far harder to rebuild than trade flows. India is not walking away out of anger, but out of strategy. The relationship no longer feels balanced. When an ally is treated like a subordinate, it looks elsewhere. And China has been waiting patiently, ready to offer quiet alternatives where America offers loud demands. The aftermath is already visible. Indian industrial giants are signing deals with Chinese clean tech firms. Farmers are demanding new markets in Asia and the Middle East. Diplomats are quietly deepening ties with Russia, Brazil, and South Africa. What began as a tariff war is evolving into a geopolitical fracture. And so, the bigger question emerges. What happens when the world's largest democracy, its fastest-growing major economy, and a nuclear power with global ambitions no longer sees itself tied to Washington's orbit? That is not just an economic problem. It is a strategic crisis. Trump's tariff move was more than a trade policy. It was a warning shot, a test of wills, and ultimately a miscalculation. Instead of isolating rivals, it has isolated America. Instead of tightening alliances, it has loosened them. And instead of keeping India close, it has pushed it into the waiting arms of China. The world is watching a shift that may define the coming decades. Power is moving, trust is eroding, alliances are bending. And Washington, once the conductor of the global orchestra, is suddenly watching from the sidelines as new players take the stage. The question now is whether the United States can repair the damage, rethink its approach, and reclaim its influence, or whether we are witnessing the dawn of a new geopolitical order, one forged not in Washington, but in Beijing and New Delhi. The tariffs that were meant to strengthen America may well be remembered as the spark that redefined global power. And that leaves us with one final question. Is this the beginning of a new chapter in world politics, where India and China rewrite the rules and the U.S. is forced to choose between leading following or falling behind? Global power is shifting, the map is being redrawn, and the world's eyes are on India, not as a subordinate, not as a pawn, but as a player that may very well determine who shapes the future.